Look, I don't say this lightly, but what just happened between the United States and Canada in the last 24 hours could completely reshape North American trade as we know it. President Trump just threatened to slap a 100% tariff on every single product coming from Canada. We're talking about doubling the price of everything from Canadian lumber to oil to cars overnight. And the reason why? It's absolutely wild. Stay with me because this rabbit hole goes way deeper than you think, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this could affect your wallet in ways you haven't even considered yet. All right, so here's what went down. Yesterday, President Trump took to Truth Social, his social media platform, and dropped an absolute bombshell. He said, and I'm reading this directly, if Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA. Now, when you first read that, you might think, okay, that's just Trump being Trump, making threats, flexing on Twitter, or Truth Social in this case. But here's the thing. This isn't an empty threat. This is a direct response to something that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney actually did last week. And before we go any further, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. This kind of analysis doesn't exist anywhere else, and I break down complex political and economic stories so you actually understand what's happening instead of just getting surface-level headlines. So what did Carney do that got Trump so fired up? Well, about a week ago, Mark Carney flew to Beijing, that's the capital of China for those who might not know, and he made a deal. Canada agreed to slash its massive 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. In return, China agreed to lower its import taxes on Canadian farm products like canola, pork, and seafood. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty standard trade deal, right? Two countries trying to help each other out economically. But here's where it gets interesting. Just a week before threatening Canada over this deal, Trump himself said it was a good idea. He literally told reporters that's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. So what changed in 7 days? Why did Trump go from praising this deal to threatening to essentially shut down Canadian imports? Here's what Trump is really worried about. And honestly, it's kind of genius when you think about the strategy, even if you don't agree with it. Trump believes Canada is going to become what he called a drop-off port for China. Let me explain what that means in simple terms. Right now, the United States has massive tariffs on Chinese goods, especially things like electric vehicles and electronics. China wants to sell their products to Americans, but those tariffs make it really expensive. So Trump thinks Canada is going to let Chinese products come into their country with low or no tariffs, and then those same products are just going to flow south across the border into the United States. In his Truth Social post, Trump wrote, if Governor Carney, and yes, he called the Prime Minister of Canada governor as an insult, suggesting Canada is just another state, thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. Now, is that actually what Canada is doing? Well, according to Canadian officials, absolutely not. Canada's minister responsible for trade with the U.S., Dominic LeBlanc, said very clearly that Canada is not pursuing a free trade deal with China. He said what they achieved was just resolution on several important tariff issues. But here's the reality, and this is where it gets complicated. There are legitimate concerns about goods moving between Canada and the United States. The two countries share the longest undefended border in the world. Nearly $2.7 billion worth of goods and services cross that border every single day. That's not a typo. Every single day. If you're enjoying this breakdown so far, go ahead and smash that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to understand what's happening. But we need to zoom out for a second because this isn't really just about tariffs or trade deals. This is about a massive shift happening in global politics right now, and Canada is caught right in the middle of it. See, for decades, and I'm talking since World War II, Canada has been one of America's closest allies. They've aligned their foreign policy with ours. They've followed our lead on things like China policy, and they've basically been our most reliable trading partner. About 60% of the crude oil that America imports comes from Canada. 85% of our electricity imports are Canadian. They're also our largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium. But something changed recently. Trump has been putting massive pressure on Canada. He's repeatedly joked about Canada becoming the 51st state. He's called their leaders names. He's threatened tariffs on Canadian goods multiple times. And he's made it clear that he expects Canada to do exactly what America wants, when America wants it. And Mark Carney? Well, he's not having it. Last week at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Carney gave this absolutely blistering speech. He didn't mention Trump by name, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. He warned about countries using tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. Then he said something that really got under Trump's skin. Middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Basically, Carney was saying that countries like Canada need to stop just following whatever the United States says and start building their own alliances. And Trump? He responded by saying, Canada lives because of the United States. Carney fired back, Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. I mean, folks, this is the kind of stuff you usually see between rival countries, not between allies. And it shows you just how much the relationship has deteriorated. Now you might be watching this and thinking, okay, but how does this actually affect me? Great question. Let's talk about what a 100% tariff on Canadian goods would actually mean for your everyday life. First, let's talk about your car. If you drive a car in America, there's a pretty good chance it has Canadian parts in it, or it was assembled in Canada. The automotive industry is massively integrated across the US-Canada border. A 100% tariff would essentially double the cost of those vehicles or parts. That means either car companies eat those costs and go out of business, or they pass them on to you. And let me tell you, they're not eating those costs. Then there's your home. Canadian lumber is everywhere in American construction. We're talking about the wood in your walls, your floors, your roof. A 100% tariff would make building new homes or renovating existing ones significantly more expensive. And we're already in a housing crisis. This would make it worse. Energy prices. Remember how I mentioned that 60% of our crude oil comes from Canada? Yeah, that oil gets refined into gasoline, double the tariff, and you're looking at potentially much higher gas prices at the pump. Even your morning routine could get more expensive. Canadian maple syrup, Canadian bacon, Canadian wheat in your bread, all of it would get hit. But here's the kicker, and this is what a lot of people don't realize about tariffs. It's not like Canada pays the tariff. American companies that import Canadian goods pay the tariff. Then those companies raise their prices to cover the cost. So ultimately, American consumers are the ones paying for it. Drop a comment below and let me know how you think this would affect your life. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective. So why is Trump really doing this? Is it just about protecting American businesses from Chinese goods sneaking in through Canada? Or is there something else going on? I think there are actually several things happening at once. First, Trump has been absolutely obsessed with the idea of bringing manufacturing back to America. He sees cheap Chinese goods as a threat to American workers. So from his perspective, if Canada is making it easier for Chinese products to compete with American products, that's a betrayal. Second, Trump is trying to renegotiate the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, which is the trade deal that replaced NAFTA. That agreement is up for review this year. By threatening massive tariffs now, Trump is creating leverage for those negotiations. He's basically saying, you better give me what I want in these talks or I'll make your economy suffer. Third, and this is the part that doesn't get talked about enough, Trump genuinely seems to want to pressure Canada into either becoming much more aligned with U.S. policy or actually joining the United States. I know that sounds crazy, but he keeps bringing it up. He's posted altered maps showing Canada as part of the U.S. He calls their Prime Minister governor. This isn't just trolling. This is psychological warfare. And finally, there's the China factor. Trump is in a full-scale economic war with China right now. He sees the world as basically two camps, the American camp and the Chinese camp. And he wants to force every country to pick a side. Canada trying to have good relations with both. In Trump's view, that's not acceptable. Before we continue, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering these developing stories as they happen, and you don't want to miss what comes next. So where does this all go from here? Well, there are a few possible scenarios, and honestly, none of them are great for anyone involved. Scenario 1. Canada backs down. They cancel or significantly scale back their deal with China. They align more closely with U.S. policy, and they basically accept that they're a junior partner to the United States. This avoids the tariffs, but it means Canada loses a lot of economic and political independence. Scenario 2. Canada stands firm. They go ahead with their China deal, Trump follows through on the 100% tariff threat, and we see a full-scale trade war between the United States and Canada. This would be economically devastating for both countries. Remember, Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. American businesses would suffer just as much as Canadian ones. Scenario 3. They negotiate. Trump's threat is an opening position. Canada makes some concessions. Trump declares victory and backs off the tariffs, and both sides save face. This is probably the most likely outcome, but it requires both leaders to be willing to compromise. And right now, both Trump and Carney seem pretty dug in. There's also a scenario 4 that people aren't talking about much, but I think it's worth considering. Canada could start building stronger economic ties with other countries, not just China, but European nations, other countries in the Americas, even developing markets. They could diversify their economy so they're less dependent on the United States. That would take years to pull off. But Carney's speech in Davos suggested that's exactly what he's thinking about. You know, this isn't the first time we've seen tensions between the U.S. and Canada over trade. Back during Trump's first term, he imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, calling them a national security threat. That was particularly insulting because Canadian soldiers have fought alongside American soldiers in basically every major conflict for the last 100 years. Those tariffs eventually got lifted, but they did real damage to the relationship. Canadian provinces started running ads in American markets talking about how interconnected the economies are. There was real anger on both sides. The difference now is that Mark Carney seems less willing to just wait it out. Justin Trudeau, the previous Prime Minister, tried to have a friendly relationship with Trump. He invited him to Canada. He praised him. He tried diplomacy. It didn't really work. Trump still bullied Canada economically. Carney has taken a different approach. He's been Prime Minister for less than a month, and he's already standing up to Trump publicly, giving speeches about resisting coercion from great powers and pursuing independent foreign policy. That's a huge shift, and it shows that Canada is genuinely rethinking its relationship with the United States. I've been reading a lot of analysis from trade experts, economists, and political scientists about this situation, and there's pretty broad consensus on a few points. First, everyone agrees that a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods would be economically catastrophic for both countries. We're talking potential recession, massive job losses on both sides of the border, and serious disruption to supply chains that have been built up over decades. Second, most experts think Trump is bluffing to some degree. The economic damage to the United States would be so severe that actually implementing these tariffs would hurt Trump politically. Voters in states that depend on Canadian trade would be furious. So the threat itself is the weapon, not the actual tariffs. Third, there's concern that this is setting a precedent for how Trump is going to handle international relations in general. If he's willing to threaten a 100% tariff on Canada, our closest ally, our biggest trading partner, a country we share a massive border with, what's he going to do to countries he's less friendly with? This could be a preview of a much more confrontational approach to global trade. And fourth, some experts are pointing out that this could actually push Canada and other American allies closer to China. If the United States is seen as unreliable or bullying, countries might decide they need to diversify their relationships. That would be a huge strategic loss for America in the long run. Make sure you hit that like button if you're finding this valuable. It really does help the algorithm show this to more people. Let's zoom out even further for a minute and talk about what this means for the global order. For the last 80 years or so, since the end of World War II, we've lived in what's called the American-led international order. Basically, the United States set the rules, created institutions like NATO and the World Trade Organization, and most of the Western world followed America's lead. But that order is breaking down. China is rising as an economic and military power. The United States under Trump is becoming more isolationist and unpredictable. European countries are trying to chart their own course. And countries like Canada are stuck in the middle, trying to figure out how to navigate this new reality. When Trump says, "Canada lives because of the United States," he's expressing a worldview where American power is absolute, and allies should be grateful for American protection. When Carney says, "If you're not at the table, you're on the menu," he's expressing a worldview where mid-sized countries need to band together to avoid being dominated by superpowers. These aren't just different trade policies. These are fundamentally different visions of how the world should work. And here's what makes this moment so significant. Canada is testing whether it's actually possible to resist American pressure in 2026. If Canada successfully maintains its trade deal with China and Trump backs down, that sends a message to every other American ally that they don't have to automatically fall in line. If Canada gets crushed economically and has to back down, that sends the opposite message. So what should you be paying attention to as this situation develops? Here are the key things I'm watching. First, watch for any statements from American business groups, particularly in industries that depend heavily on Canadian trade. Auto manufacturers, energy companies, construction firms. If they start lobbying against these tariffs, that's a sign Trump might back down. Second, watch what other countries say. Is Europe defending Canada's right to make its own trade deals? Are other Asian countries supporting Canada's approach to China? If Canada starts getting international backing, that changes the dynamic. Third, watch the actual negotiations around the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement review. That's where the real deal-making will probably happen. The tariff threats might be theater, but the trade agreement negotiations are where actual policy gets made. Fourth, watch public opinion polls in both countries. If Americans start seeing gas prices spike or car prices jump and they blame Trump's tariffs, that's politically dangerous for him. If Canadians rally around Carney and support standing up to American pressure, that gives him more room to be tough. And fifth, watch what China does. Are they offering Canada even more trade concessions to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Canada? Are they being smart about this? Or are they going to overplay their hand? You know, it's easy to talk about tariffs and trade deals and geopolitics as if they're just abstract concepts. But these decisions affect real people's lives in really concrete ways. If these tariffs actually happen, There are going to be American factory workers who lose their jobs because the companies they work for can't afford the higher costs of imported parts. There are going to be Canadian exporters who go out of business because they can't sell into the American market anymore. There are going to be families on both sides of the border who've been living in one country and working in the other, who suddenly find that doesn't work anymore. And it's not just economic. Families are split across the US-Canada border. People have relatives on both sides. Students go to universities across the border. There's cultural exchange, shared history, shared values. A serious deterioration in the relationship affects all of that. I've seen comments from people saying, "Good, we should be tougher on Canada," or "Finally someone's standing up to American bullying." But the reality is, both populations are going to suffer if this turns into a real trade war. There are no winners here, only degrees of losing. Look, here's the bottom line. What's happening right now between the United States and Canada is a major test of the future of North American relations. Trump's 100% tariff threat is either a negotiating tactic that will blow over, or it's the beginning of a fundamental realignment of how these two countries interact with each other. For average Americans, the most likely outcome is that this gets resolved through backroom negotiations, and most people never notice any real impact. But there's a real chance that if both sides stay stubborn, we could see significant economic disruption. So what can you do about it? First, stay informed. Don't just read headlines. Actually understand what's happening and why. Second, if you work in an industry that would be affected by these tariffs, reach out to your representatives in Congress. Let them know your concerns. They need to hear from real constituents, not just lobbyists. Third, prepare for the possibility of higher prices on certain goods. That doesn't mean panic buying or anything crazy, but maybe don't put off major purchases that involve Canadian goods if you were planning to make them anyway. And most importantly, remember that international relations are complicated. The people on the other side of these disputes, whether that's Trump, Carney, Chinese officials, whoever, they're operating with different information, different incentives, and different worldviews than you might have. Understanding why people make the decisions they make doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but it helps you navigate the situation more effectively. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I'm going to be following this story as it develops, and you're going to want to see the updates. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Trump is bluffing? Do you think Canada should stand firm or make a deal? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think. And finally, hit that like button and share this video with anyone you know who's trying to understand what's happening with US-Canada relations. This is a huge story that's going to have real consequences, and more people need to understand what's actually going on. I'll see you in the next video. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, the world is complicated, but that doesn't mean we can't understand it.